by the name of Martini, and the endocrine system was at the very end of the book, which never made any sense because the nervous system and the endocrine system kind of work, to use an anthropomorphic term, hand in hand to accomplish similar objectives. So before we actually get into endocrine organs, to give you kind of a background of what we're looking at with the endocrine system, the molecules, both of them are used to change the behavior of cells, even some not through the same G protein or ion channel type of pathways. So the molecules that are released by the nervous system are known as, and I'm speaking to the choir here, neurotransmitters, right? And the molecules released by the endocrine system are known as what? Hormones. What would they have in common as far as how they are recognized by the cell whose behavior they are changing? Receptors, all right? So we have for the neurons our presynaptic membrane, and the neurotransmitters diffuse across a narrow space and bound to a receptor. That's what provides the specificity. So if there's no receptor, there's no effect between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. Right? If we look at hormones, we have a glandular cell, or cellular gland. Hormones, by definition, are molecules that are released and travel via the blood supply. So these would be capillaries. And these would be epithelial cells primarily. We have a couple of organs where they are nerve cells. And so they get in the blood, and they travel to another series of cells that either have a receptor inside the cell or a receptor on the surface of the cell. So this is called the effector organ, or one that is affected. So they, if we're looking at similarities, they both will have a limited function only on those cells that have receptors. They both will cause a change in the behavior of the cell. So forming an action potential, causing, if it was a muscle cell, all the troponin, calcium, tropomyosin, binding of actin myosin. So they're both going to do that. What would be some differences in how they work, or yes? Okay, so the time that it takes to cause. I can cause my muscles to contract and relax really fast. All right, meaning that the neurotransmitter is binding to its receptor and then being broken down chemically. So one reason that we have a rapid onset of action is that there is a shorter distance. For the receptor. Our synaptic cleft obviously is much shorter a distance to travel than, say, from the pituitary gland to the testicles or the ovaries. So this is going to have a longer period before onset. Now, it's not just a muscle and sending that signal down the axon, and I cause my flexor muscles to contract, I can immediately cause the opposite to occur, meaning the contracting muscles have to at least relax. So to do so, we have to remove the neurotransmitter from its receptor. And that's done relatively quickly as well. So cessation is rapid as well. If we had acetylcholine binding to its receptor, how do we stop acetylcholine from keeping that sodium channel open? Exactly. We use acetylcholinesterase to break it down. Anybody remember the enzyme if it was norepinephrine? That's found, the norepinephrine is taken back up into this neuron. MAOs, ever heard of MAO inhibitors? Monoamine oxidase. All right, so we have these chemicals that will break this down immediately so we can remove it so that the cell is ready to respond again. We don't have that for hormones. What happens with hormones? What are we waiting for? They're in the blood. So they might bind to hormones that keep them to proteins that keep them active, but typically we have to wait for that to occur. We have to wait for their levels to fall by being taken up and excreted through the urinary system. So that's a prolonged period of time. The half-life of hormones in the blood can be 20 minutes to several hours. So slow cessation. Some neurotransmitters can also be hormones. I utilize the carpooling not in the spirit in which it was intended, but in other words, I'm not carpooling, I'm taking my kids to school. So I've got 2 or 3 people in the car. And when it's Thanksgiving and they have the week off, I stay here till like 7 o'clock at night because it's not worth sitting in traffic. I live in Elk Grove, so it takes me a long time to get down there in either freeway on Thanksgiving week. So last January, I'm driving down. I'm in the carpool lane. I've got 2 kids in the car with me. I'm going 63 miles an hour, and the lights go on in a sheriff's CHP car behind me. I'm complaining to the kids. What? I'm fine. I'm not breaking any rules. But guess what? My heart rate still went up. So I pull over to the side of the road, and the first thing out of the officer's mouth is, why don't you have an easy pass, HOV thing on your vehicle? Pulled me over for that. I said, because they don't work anymore. They're not allowed anymore. He says, well, I noticed that you don't have your vehicle registration. It says December, and it's now January. I said, really? I said, I know it came in the mail, and my husband went out to the garage so I'm calling my husband on the phone. You made me get a ticket. Well, it had come, and he'd taken it to the office to photocopy it, and he had to put it on the car. So I got a fix-it ticket. And the $25 fee to whatever, pass it through the courts. Okay. So I drive home. I get back on the freeway. It's now 5 minutes since those lights first went off, and guess what? My heart rate is still too fast. If it was a nervous system and neuroepinephrine made my heart rate go up, at the ganglia there, at the SA node in my heart, it should be broken down by now. So why is my heart rate still, 110 beats a minute? Throw my 78 in my cell. Norepinephrine is also released by cells in the adrenal gland into the bloodstream. So while the neuron norepinephrine is already broken down, I still have norepinephrine circulating in the blood. Our cells can't tell the difference. They're getting norepinephrine, binding it, and creating a rapid firing of the SA node. One of the case studies is on a heart transplant. A young woman who developed a virus, and when she was, I think, around 30, developed cardiac myopathy and had to have a heart transplant. She climbs mountains, and her goal was to climb the highest peak on every continent. 2 years after her transplant, she climbed Mount Kilimanjaro in southern Africa. we start to exercise, what happens to our heart rate? It goes up. And if we're in good shape, 5 minutes after we quit exercising, it should be back within a normal range. All right? Just stretching your muscles fires proprioceptors and triggers the neurons in the heart to cause the pacemaker, the SA node, to fire more rapidly. She didn't have those. So her heart rate took a while to catch up to her exercise. She had to go really slow, allowing the norepinephrine from her adrenal glands, they cap on top of the kidneys, to dump enough norepinephrine in the blood to get her heart rate going to keep up with her oxygen need. All right, so she climbs the mountain. She's up there. It takes forever for her heart rate to come back down again because she has no acetylcholine that we would use to slow our heart rate down and bring it back to a normal range. What is she dependent on? She's dependent on the norepinephrine being removed from the blood. There is no acetylcholine being released as a hormone. All right, so that kind of illustrates how those two vary in rate as far as their effectiveness. This diagram up here, so that's kind of just an introduction to the two. The two work actually hand in hand, as I just showed you. They cause changes in behavior. So turning on, turning off, increasing metabolic rate, regulating the activities of cells in the thyroid gland or the ovaries, which regulate changes in secretory, a whole range of components. This image here lists some of the endocrine organs, which we'll be looking at on Thursday. We're not going to learn the hormone names and the mechanisms of all of those, this unit, like some of your classmates might be doing, or friends from last semester. Maybe they started out with the heart. Because we'll pick up the kidneys an endocrine organ. It makes erythropoietin, increasing the EPO that you've been hearing about. We'll talk about that when we talk about blood. The heart makes adrenatriuretic peptide. We'll talk about that hormone when we talk about blood pressure. Almost all of our digestive organs, not just the pancreas, but the small intestine and the stomach, are endocrine organs. All right. So we'll be looking at those as we move through. The two organs that I want you to know function and mechanism for are pituitary and thyroid. All right. In lab, yeah, I want you to be able to recognize them, all of them, but you don't have to know what hormones are being made, what those hormones do, except for pituitary, thyroid, and parathyroid. So we're going to start with pituitary. Notice they have hypothalamus up here. What did you learn about the hypothalamus in Bio 430? It did a bunch of stuff. Thirst, feeling full, autonomic nervous system, rage. It also regulates the pituitary gland. So older editions of anatomy and physiology often call the pituitary gland the master gland of the body. Because here's a list of some of the hormones, and you have this diagram or one similar to it, but it makes ACTH. That activates the adrenal gland. TSH, that activates the thyroid. GH, growth hormone, muscles, and a lot of other growth. Prolactin, mammary tissue. FSH and LH, ovaries and testes. MSH, for the pineal gland. And then it actually makes oxytocin and ADH. So it sends out, except for growth hormone, it sends out hormones that affect other hormones. So yes, it does control other endocrine organs, but it itself is controlled by the hypothalamus, all right, which sits just above it. So here's a section through a cadaver's skull. This would be the nasal cavity. You recognize the frontal sinus and the sphenoid sinus. And just above that is the sella turcica. What bone is that, by the way?
Sphenoid.
Sphenoid bone. Okay? In fact, access, and so it has a pituitary gland, the hyperprolactinemia case study is a pituitary adenoma. It's not malignant, but as it enlarges, it can push on the optic nerve right here. And can be like Cushing's syndrome and stuff, so they may want to remove part of the pituitary gland. And access is through the nasal cavity, fracturing the bone of the sphenoid sinus and the sella turcica, and then getting to the pituitary gland. It's most effective if your surgeon does 300 of those a year. Obviously, a few hundred people had to be the first one. So if they take out too much of the pituitary, then you have other problems. Right? Let's take a look. That's its location. This would be the hypothalamus up here. And part of the hypothalamus descends down to form the posterior pituitary, and the stalk in the middle is called the infundibulum. Well, when you dissected the sheep brain, it just tore off right away. All right? So here's a little bit of the embryological development that helps to explain the presence of both nerve tissue and epithelial tissue. Epithelial histology in Bio 430. Remember, epithelial tissues form lining, covering, and glandular structures. So a covering epithelium or a lining epithelium could invaginate and form, say, a sebaceous gland and secrete onto the surface through a duct. If it was connected to the surface via duct, we call that an exocrine. So obviously in the skin, we had sweat glands and sebaceous glands. We have exocrine glands that form the intestinal glands of the small intestine. The liver, they're connected to the small intestine via bile ducts. Pancreas has a duct for digestive enzymes. However, if these epithelial cells separate from the surface and require the presence of blood vessels, these would be capillaries, and these would be cells, then this is known as endocrine. Before I get back to this, there's a couple of other terms that I'll go over here. One is paracrine, and the other is autocrine. Some textbooks include these as kind of a subset of endocrine, and others say they're not endocrine because they're not going into the blood. Okay? I just want you to know what the pathway is. I won't test you on is it or isn't it an endocrine. Paracrine means that the cell secretions are going to other cells that are so close, there's no need to go into the blood. They just diffuse through extracellular fluid. So this cell is making hormones that are binding to receptors right nearby. Doesn't have to travel the systemic circuit of the blood. Autocrine, auto meaning self. The cell is self-stimulatory. Makes its own hormones that bind to its own receptors. I had to go out and come back in again. It just could have stayed inside the cell. But the nervous system, the pituitary gland, is a concept that we look at over there on the upper right. I don't know, those that had me last semester, we did neuroembryology, and some of you, most of you probably covered this to some extent, but if we look at the developing embryo, we had the spinal visceral canal developing, and then remember we had the vesicles developing into the brain, forming the ventricles. And from this third ventricle, we have the diencephalon developing, and out of the diencephalon we have the optic nerve forming. We we also have the pituitary gland from the floor of the third ventricle. So I'm going to redraw that. I'll leave that up there. Just wanted to give you a smaller concept. So this would be this base would be third ventricle. Diencephalon, remember, becomes the thalamus and hypothalamus. Combining words here, it doesn't make any sense. So part of the pituitary gland grows into an outpouching from the floor of the third ventricle. As such, it is formed of neurons whose cell bodies are found in the hypothalamus and send their axons down into the posterior pituitary. That's what the posterior pituitary is. It's axons whose cell bodies are forming nuclei in the hypothalamus. This would be the posterior pituitary. Because it's formed of neurons, it's also given the name neurohypophysis. And if you're not used to it by now, we always have lots of different names for the same thing. Pars nervosa. So the hormones, and there are two, that are released from the posterior pituitary gland are really neurotransmitters made by those neuron cell bodies secreted into the blood from capillaries that are around the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary does not synthesize them, it secretes them. The synthesis occurs up here in the hypothalamus. So another reason why the hypothalamus is really the master over the endocrine system. So that would be this structure. Most of our endocrine organs are epithelial in origin. And so from the roof of the mouth of the embryo, we have an outpouching that goes up and matches. Now typically that separates. All right, though occasionally there might be a small narrow channel or cyst that remains from the upper pharynx up to that area. So we would have then this structure forming, which is the anterior pituitary. Adenohypophysis. Or pars distalis. It doesn't make any sense because distal usually means farther away, but it's talking about its origin. Okay, not distal in the sense of posterior, not behind it. So the anterior pituitary gland is the one that makes most of the hormones being released by the pituitary gland. Again, we'll be looking at these in a little bit more detail as we move through the semester. Posterior pituitary only makes two. One of them we'll talk about in this unit. And that is oxytocin. Nobody caught me on that slip. The posterior pituitary doesn't make any. Posterior pituitary secretes two. And these are made by the hypothalamus. Oxytocin is a hormone that causes the uterus to contract during labor when a baby is born. And it also results in milk being released from mammary tissue. It doesn't cause the mammary gland to make milk, but the milk letdown reflex. The other hormone works on the adrenal gland, rather the kidney, and it's anti-diuretic hormone. It causes the body to reabsorb water. Those are the only two hormones released by the posterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary makes quite a few. We're going to look at 3 of them in this unit. And the words are kind of good symbols. So LH, luteinizing hormone. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. And these are involved in reproductive. So both male and female gonads, the ovaries and testes, will be affected by those. Prolactin is what triggers the cells of the mammary gland to start synthesizing milk. So we'll be talking about that one as well. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, and we'll talk about the thyroid on Thursday. ACTH is adrenocortical, means the cortex of the adrenal gland. Growth hormone we'll talk about at the end of this semester when we do the digestive system. Obviously, its name is indicative. MSH affects the pituitary, the pineal gland, and we won't spend much time on this. Trying to think if there's any that I'm missing. All right, so that's why the pituitary gland was called the master gland, because these hormones all affect additional organs in the body in a regulatory manner. But still, the thalamus regulates even the pituitary. So the hypothalamus makes 2 hormones, and then it regulates the release of all those others on the left-hand side. So here's an image of kind of the reverse. This would be the anterior pituitary, and this is the posterior pituitary. If we look a little closer,
Can you turn one of the lights?
these are, yes.
Can you turn one of the lights down?
Oh, sure. These are the cells that make ACTH or LH or FSH. All right. When you read about it, I don't use these terms, so you don't have to worry about knowing which is which. You can see that they take different degrees of staining. Some stain more red, some stain light blue or dark blue. You were taking a histology class, where the entire class was histology. You would learn to recognize those, but they're kind of in groups. So luteinizing and FSH come from gonadotropes. Thyroid stimulating comes from thyrotropes. Prolactin comes from lactotropes. Right? So it's just kind of a grouping of the cells that make those various types of hormones. Remember, this is epithelial in origin. So all those cells that you're seeing up there, other than the little capillaries, are epithelial cells. Contrast this image with this one. You can see a few are known as pituocytes, and they're just supportive cells. The rest of what you're looking at, other than these capillaries here, 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 these are the pituocytes. All of these are axons. Remember, the posterior pituitary is made of axons from cell bodies found in the hypothalamus. And so it has this fibrous appearance because that's what it is. Strands of nerve fibers, the axons, with dilated synaptic bulbs containing oxytocin and ADH. Now, you could just memorize those images, but if you understand why that has that appearance, guess what? It's a lot easier to remember that that's pars nervosa than just memorizing the name of one versus the name of the other. You can figure it out.